we're partners in crime, and it's been a very, very good relationship and continues to be. Actually, we have a lot of fun.
Yes, we do.
We laugh at ourselves and others all the time.
We've not actually fallen out, which is also, after 25 years, is pretty good.
It's pretty good not to have fallen out. Not once.
Nuffield Foundation.
The Nuffield Foundation has funded the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime for about a quarter of a century. The study is a longitudinal programme of research which looks at pathways into and out of offending for a cohort of about 4,300 people who started secondary school in the year 1998, and we've been following them up over the last 25 years to see how their lives have changed over time.
I think one of the most important findings is the way in which juvenile justice systems, even though they may be benign in intention, actually can have quite negative effects, because some of the institutional cultural practices lead to the recycling of certain young people again and again into the system, and that has negative effects on their behaviour, surprisingly. And it's usually young people from the most poor backgrounds, the most vulnerable backgrounds, that get sucked into systems. A second really important finding is around educational inclusion and the ways in which educational exclusion can be one of the most devastating things that can happen to a young person, and is actually associated with many, many negative outcomes, and particularly associated with pathways into serious offending behaviour. Early trauma is also associated with serious offending behaviour too, and so a really important finding from the study is that you need to have upstream investment in early years in order to make a difference to people's lives and to actually reduce serious offending in the longer term.
So offending is actually quite a normal aspect of a young person's life. It's part of their cohort, their context in growing up. But we also found that those young people who were involved in more serious and persistent offending tended to be ones who were much more vulnerable in other aspects of their lives. They were more likely to have grown up in poverty, more likely to have experienced family disruption, for example, parental breakup, more likely to have experienced bereavement, and also more likely to have had a number of other disadvantages in their lives. And those are the young people, unfortunately, that get caught up in the justice system, and we see that young people who get caught up in the justice system tend to have more negative outcomes later on in life.
I think one of the most surprising things was when we were interviewing the cohort in the most recent phase, when they were aged 35. And in fact, when people were talking about stopping offending, they didn't really mention the justice system at all. It was mostly about having warm and loving relationships, having a job. And the criminal justice system was almost this thing that they had to negotiate that was over there. It wasn't a main part of their lives. I think that was quite surprising.
Yes.
What we did also find, though, was it wasn't so much programmes or systems where things were positively perceived. It was mostly to do with an individual worker or a foster carer or somebody who had made a real difference, and there was a kind of strong, positive relationship, almost sometimes a loving relationship between the worker and the individual in the cohort. And that was the thing that made the difference. It was not the programme or the system, it's more an individual. So I think one of our strong findings is the importance of actually investing in people, investing in youth workers, investing in foster carers, supporting foster carers. That was seen to make a really big difference.
One of the first impacts that we had was to influence the introduction of a new holistic policy for children, young people, known as Getting It Right for Every Child, or GIRFEC. That came in around 2006. And what that did was to make a lot of the policy making within government much more child-focused, child-centred. And some of the policies around, for example, school exclusion started to change. So rather than focusing on school exclusion, there was a focus instead on inclusion, keeping children, young people in schools and dealing with some of the difficult contexts in their lives within the school environment. That then led to changes in the youth justice system in Scotland, so we saw the introduction of a new approach to dealing with young people who offend, called the whole systems approach. What that meant in essence was much more early and effective intervention through multi-agency responses. So rather than sending children to the youth justice system, practitioners would get together from a range of areas and discuss what would be in the child's best interests and what should be done before an official referral into youth justice was made. And we also saw an increase in diversion, particularly for 16, 17-year-olds away from the criminal justice system, because at that time there was a large increase. That then led on to a change in the law, which meant a presumption of no prosecution for children and young people, which eventually then led on to a change in the age of criminal responsibility in Scotland. Scotland had at that time one of the lowest ages of criminal responsibility internationally at age 8, which was incredibly low. The UN minimum standard at that time was 12. Our research was one of the most important pieces of evidence that was used to ensure that the age of criminal responsibility in Scotland was raised to 12.
Since the whole system approach has been introduced, there have been major reductions in the number of young people getting involved in the juvenile justice system. There's been an 89% reduction in offence referrals to the children's hearing system. There's been a major reduction, over 90% reduction in the number of 16 and 17-year-olds that are being convicted in the criminal courts, because they are routinely dealt with in the adult criminal courts in Scotland. And there has been a massive decrease in the number of young people who've ended up in custody, a 98% reduction since a peak in round about 2006 to 7. That's at its lowest level for at least 50 years, and possibly even longer than that. And it's this whole system approach and this general approach towards youth offending that has actually led, we think, to those kind of declines in the numbers. And I think it's something that we feel, if we've contributed in some way with the study findings, we're deeply proud of that. I think it makes all the difference to young people. I mean, going into prison is one of the most devastating things that can happen in a child's life, in terms of their relationships, in terms of their education, in terms of what happens to them afterwards and the support that they might get afterwards. So it enables people to be held in the community, it enables support and services to be delivered in a community setting, and that just has a much more positive outcome for a young person than being sent to prison. And thinking about the system holistically has enabled policymakers to have that effect, and they've drawn on our findings for that.
I think it's entirely possible that these sorts of important policy changes won't happen unless we have continued investment in social research that brings solid, robust evidence to policymakers and shows them the impact of bad policies, so that they can then put their efforts and energies into promoting good policies. We do know that we have been influential in shaping and changing narratives in other parts of the UK. For example, the youth offending teams we know use our work to determine some of the programmes that are developed in England and Wales. We are having an influence for those who are trying to increase the age of criminal responsibility in other countries. That includes Northern Ireland, which is local, but also Australia. They're looking very much to the work that we did in Scotland to shape that. It's a challenge to get funding in general, especially for social science research. Social science research is funded to a much lower level than some other types of research. And of course, youth justice research within social sciences is a small slice of that pie as well. The fact that we've seen youth crime dropping across the UK, Scotland and other countries means that perhaps it becomes less on the political agenda, and then once something's less on the political agenda, it can tend to slip down the research agenda as well. So we perhaps haven't seen as many new youth justice studies coming through in recent years than we saw maybe 20 years ago, when crime was more of a hot political topic. So that can be difficult because, of course, the young people who continue to be involved in offending and getting involved in the youth justice system are actually a much more vulnerable group with very complex needs these days compared to maybe in the past. So there is a real need to understand how the lives of these young people are impacted by their contact with youth justice, and what more effective programmes might be put in place to ensure they don't offend in the future, because of course their offending then impacts on society more generally. So it's a false economy not to put further funding into research for these really important social problems, even if the problem seemed to be abating compared to previous years.
It is really important to have robust research evidence about many of the things that social research covers in order to promote individual and people's well-being in order to have well-evidenced policies that are going to be impactful. It's just really important that that is funded. Some of the most fundamental questions that we are facing in our society are things that social research can actually help us address, such as poverty, such as well-being, such as some of the climate justice research as well. It needs social research to be underpinning as well.
If we didn't do social research, we would only hear the voices of those people that are able to shout the loudest. And quite often it's the voices of people who don't have any way of getting their views across or getting people to understand how problems are impacting on them. They're the kind of critical voices, and that's why the Edinburgh study, we use a variety of methods to try and understand how people's lives have changed as they develop, as they get older. And we give those voices to policymakers and practitioners so that they are able to understand how we could develop better services, how we could have much more effective policies, how we can develop modes of practice within health, within social work, within the policing that actually impacts more positively on people's lives and reduces inequality and improves fairness. The Nuffield Foundation have been incredible supporters of the Edinburgh study and I think of us as researchers more generally. The process of applying for funding through Nuffield is very rigorous, but it's incredibly helpful, and the trustees and reviewers that look at the applications always provide a lot of additional comments and helpful, critical but useful advice for developing the research to make sure that it's the best possible project it can be. And we found that the research findings are of huge interest to Nuffield, and they always try to maximise the value of the findings.
What I think is deeply valuable about the Nuffield Foundation is the way in which it emphasises policy impact and practitioner impact. It wants the research to actually be made useful, and that's something that obviously is an ethos that we share. So that's important to me. The other thing I think that's important about the Nuffield Foundation is the way in which it can fund quite small pieces of research as well as relatively large pieces of research. And I think that kind of funding is getting more scarce. For people to be able to start building a research career and getting funding for important research, sometimes having those smaller pockets of money, sometimes a few thousand, sometimes tens of thousands, is actually really important. And the fact that the Nuffield Foundation is willing to do that kind of funding, and it's for useful research, I think, is what makes it a very important foundation indeed.
The Nuffield Foundation's engagement with the research and their desire to be involved in the project all the way through is much greater. So quite often you'll have a funder who you have to do a lot of work to get the funding at the beginning, but then they give you the money and they leave you alone for 3 years and then come back at the end and see what happened. Whereas Nuffield are much more engaged all the way through the project, and that's not just to monitor progress and make sure that you're spending the money wisely. It's actually because they're incredibly interested in finding out what the findings are, trying to capitalise early on any impact that it might have had, trying to identify where the research findings might be going so that they can think kind of forward about who to best disseminate that work to. So I think for me it's that co-production of the research, the collaboration and the deep degree of interest in what we're doing and how it could best be used to impact on a wider range of audiences.
That's a very successful marriage. Practically a marriage.
Practically, yes.